Council. He writes regularly for Corporate Knights magazine as well. Until September of 2019, Shawn was the national business correspondent with the Globe and Mail, covering global energy beat from the paper's parliamentary bureau in Ottawa. So pass it over to you, Shawn.
I think I'll be used to turning off mute by now. Thanks very much, Brenna. Welcome everybody, and thanks to the organizer for including me here. I'm looking forward to the conversation. I think it's a critical one, and one not often focused on when we talk about the transition, and that is transmission, and how we organize our electricity system to deliver clean, affordable power in a way that benefits a multitude of stakeholders, and getting it right. The government of Canada has talked about an Atlantic Loop initiative, which would tie Quebec and Atlantic Canada together. Unfortunately, often it's talked about as a unidirectional energy flowing from Labrador and Quebec to help clean the grid in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick. And I think we want to talk today about how a multi-directional, how an integrated system would achieve better outcomes. So we have a stellar panel. I will introduce them, and then we're going to, each of the panelists will have an opening, some opening remarks. Then I will moderate some discussion among them, and then we will wrap up with Q&A for you people, for the audience. And please enter those in the Q&A section under the Zoom link there, and we will pose them to the panel, as many as we can within our time frame. Let me introduce the panel to you. Pierre-Olivier Pineau is chair of the Energy Sector Management, chair of Energy Sector Management at HEC Montréal. He's an economist and lecturer whose research focuses in part on power grid integration. His research is unique in Canada almost, in that he focuses on cross-border transmission developments in the Northeast. Tom Manicom is Power Systems Engineer at the UK's National Grid ESO. Tom has commercial, regulatory, and policy insights from across a multitude of interested parties who help shape the UK grid policies. National Grid ESO was recently spun out of the National Transmission Utility, providing a more neutral platform for planning of transmission in the UK. Rob Gramlich is president of Grid Strategies LLC in the US. He's a former advisor at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, in the US. Rob has enjoyed a career advising public and private sector clients on a myriad of regulatory, economic, and planning process matters related to power transmission. In the last few years, his advocacy work on behalf of the trade group, Americans for a Clean Energy Grid, helped to move the needle on transmission development in the USA. And Elisa Obermann is Executive Director at Marine Renewables Canada. Elisa's Rolodex has expanded exponentially in the last year as offshore wind developers have descended on Eastern Canada, and she'll highlight for us the impediments she sees and the opportunities to develop deploying offshore wind for Eastern Canada. So without further ado, Pierre-Olivier is going to kick it off, and over to you, Pierre-Olivier.
Thank you, Shawn. I'll share my screen and you should be able to see it. So I'll probably be able to set a general perspective on the role of market integration to decarbonize. So I have a very short presentation making a few points and basically asking the question, do we want an efficient or inefficient decarbonization to happen? And of course, we all want efficiency. So therefore, we should want market integration. I'll I'll basically talk about the NPCC region, which is the Northeast region in which the Atlantic provinces are included. But that, the NPCC is the Northeast Power Coordinating Council, which is a reliability organization, including Ontario, Quebec, most of the Atlantic provinces, all of New England and New York. And they discuss reliability issues. But it's also a natural region for trade, with Quebec being involved in a lot of trade with New York, New England, Ontario, and the Atlantic provinces. When we look at the key characteristics of that region, you can see that, well, first, that Quebec is at the center. We are a relatively small province compared to Ontario and New York and New England, but we produce in Quebec, and I'm from Quebec, there's a lot of hydropower production in Quebec. So actually, as you can see, in terms of terawatt hour, Quebec is producing a lot with an extremely low carbon content that you can see in red in the figures provided there, a much lower carbon content per kilowatt hour and a much lower price. That's the retail residential price in US cents per kilowatt hour. So it's an incredibly low price compared to all other neighbors of Quebec. So that should naturally set a context for a lot of trade, because you would say, well, clean, cheap electricity should flow more naturally towards neighbors. So that rationale was true for many years. It's still true, but the context is changing because we want to decarbonize. So the rationale for trade is even bigger now when we want to decarbonize. For one key reason is that decarbonization rhymes a lot with renewable penetration, intermittent renewable penetration, wind, solar, offshore wind. And for that, you need more storage. And there's one tiny number that you can see at the north of Quebec, storage. There is an existing storage capacity in hydro dams in Quebec of 176 terawatt hour. And then in Labrador, you also have 27 terawatt hour of storage. That's hydropower storage in existing dams that could be used differently than how it is used now to integrate intermittent renewable generation coming from other regions. So the rationale for regional integration is bigger than ever, because with decarbonization, we need to balance intermittent power sources. So with my team, we've done some simulation, and I'll just show you one graph. This is the yearly decarbonization cost, depending on how much trade, meaning you can allow through the transmission line you can have. So on the horizontal axis, you can see the decarbonization level, and it seems that we want by 2050 to go to 100% decarbonization. We are, in the region already at 50 or 60% decarbonization. In the grid is already mostly decarbonized. Even in the US, in New York and New England, it's mostly there's 50% natural gas, but the other 50% is nuclear or hydro. So it's already about 50%. And in this case, adding transmission doesn't help a lot. But if you want to go to 100% decarbonization, so that means no greenhouse gases, no fossil fuel generation, then you can see the no new transmission cost would be around $22 billion per year in terms of additional capacity. If you can build additional transmission, then basically you see the cost going down big time in our simulations. But our simulation is robust to different scenarios, and that includes the cost of transmission. So it allows for more transmission. And if really people don't like transmission and say transmission lines are bad, you can always look at the no trade scenario. So that's the scenario where we basically remove the transmission line. If people don't like transmission, they should go up to the idea of removing ties between provinces, and we're only, in our models, we're only looking at the different regions. So we have like Ontario, Quebec, New England, Ontario, New York, and Atlantic. And if you remove all the interties, then we are in the no trade scenario. And if you just stop trade, then you see the cost exploding to some levels that nobody wants to go to. So the key message here is that if we want to decarbonize efficiently, we need more transmission to allow trade to happen, and that will lower big time the cost of decarbonization. From the no new transmission, which is the current situation now, if we were going to optimal transmission, then that would allow for a lot of benefits. In terms of wind penetration, I've just shown you a few statistics here. the way we would operate hydropower would be totally would be correlated with wind, but anti-correlated with wind, because currently there's no correlation between hydro and wind generation. But if there was more integration, basically hydro would be lower when there's wind, and when there's no wind, hydro would jump up. So that's why the correlation would move from 0 to minus 0.28. There would be more wind generation with optimal transmission in our simulations, and then we would basically cut wind curtailments, because basically we would be able to take the wind when it's available and not have to curtail it, as it is often the case in regions where the wind cannot go elsewhere because of the lack of transmission lines. Currently, if we look at the Northeast transmission lines, here is the state of the situation. There are weak links between different Atlantic regions. So we would definitely need much more if we want to add offshore winds. And these interties and additional transmission lines would absolutely be needed to actually get the surplus energy when there's a surplus, and get some energy when they need to be balanced because there's a lack of wind. So I don't want to take much more time. I just want to highlight that if you want more studies on this, then you can get some of the studies I've done. And I'd like to thank you. And of course, we'll welcome your questions when times come for that.
Thank you very much, Pierre-Olivier. Tom, can you tell us a little bit about how we're planning the system in the UK?
Lovely. Thank you very much. 2 seconds. Let me just share my screen, which hopefully is all happy and good. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we're good.
Lovely. Cool. Thank you very much. My name is Tom Manicom. I'm coming from the UK, and I work for National Grid ESO, which is the independent system operator for the Great British market. I appreciate the British market is probably quite different and remote, so I thought I'd just set a little bit of context about who we are and where we sit. So following privatization, there are 3 transmission owner companies in the UK. They have distinct geographic regions. So in the north of Scotland, we have SSE. In the Scottish Lowlands, effectively southern Scotland, we have Scottish Power. And in England and Wales, we have National Grid Electricity Transmission. Above all of those companies, we have National Grid ESO, which is effectively the system operator. While we are still part of the National Grid family, we are a legally separate company. And effectively, our role is to facilitate competition and fairness on behalf of the regulator, Ofgem, who effectively exist as an NGO to implement government policy.
Tom, your slides are not moving.
My slides aren't moving. Okay. 2 seconds. Let me just share again. There we go. Has that changed? Sorry.
Yeah, that looks better. Thanks.
Lovely. Thank you. So it probably makes a little bit more sense now with the context of the map. So as I was saying, in the north of Scotland, lowland Scotland, and England and Wales, we have 3 distinct transmission owners. And we also have the additional complication of devolved governments and devolved seabed leasing as well, which is probably quite representative of the situation, as I understand it, in Canada between different federal parties. But I'll just move on. In 2020, we were asked by our government to effectively come up with a different way to develop offshore wind, as we'd previously been doing it. I think everyone had recognized that our approach to date hadn't been sustainable, and a lot of the development had been focused on very small areas of the country, and had led to effectively unfair impacts on relatively small areas of the coastline, and communities felt that they had been unduly impacted. This approach had also meant that we required a lot of onshore transmission investment, and my background is in onshore transmission investment primarily. So it was very nice to hear earlier that it's definitely needed, because I'm going to say exactly the same thing. And effectively, through this review, we came up with 4 design objectives that we wanted to consider a new holistic way to plan the network. And we didn't just care anymore about having a good engineering solution, and we didn't just care about making it economic and efficient. We also wanted to account for our impact on the environment and also our impact on our local communities. So these objectives are all equally weighted now. So you can effectively say one doesn't outweigh the other, which is massively different to what we've historically done. And all of this put together lets us achieve our government's target of achieving 50 gigawatts of offshore wind connections by 2030 in British waters, which is massive considering we're at about 11 gigawatts at the moment. So we've got a lot of work to do, but that's what we've been planning for. So on the right here, I've got a map of effectively what we see Britain looking like in 2030. And there are a very scary amount of new lines on there. And I think the first thing I really want to say is that a lot of this was going to happen anyway and was necessary to happen to decarbonize our system. We have a large renewable base further north in the country, and most of our demand is in the south. And effectively, to utilize our renewable energy sources, we need to get power from north to south of the country. And this is, again, very different to how things were done in the past, where generation was centered around large coal fields, large rivers. We're now talking about a much more decentralized version of what's already happened. Our challenge with this first iteration of the design was to connect 23 gigawatts of offshore wind, which is fairly massive considering the majority of that was based in Scotland. At the moment, Scotland's got a peak demand of about 5 gigawatts. So a really huge differential there between what the local demand is and where we effectively want to get the power to. So everything follows a north to south approach. We looked to limit landing points. For these 18 projects, we managed to limit that to 15 landing points, whereas our business as usual approach would have been to have 18 distinct landing points. We've also managed to link different regions together through this approach. So the offshore assets we're building aren't just about connecting these generators to shore. They also provide a transmission benefit, which leads to a cost reduction for consumers. And we've also identified what works we need to have onshore as well to actually facilitate economic flows around the country. Again, it's all well and good building this generation, but if we can't get it to people who need to use it, we can't decarbonize our system. It's as simple as that. And the other benefit we've really seen is that even in times where we've not found it to be economic and efficient or to provide significant cost savings, by taking this more holistic view, we're able to reuse and more appropriately use the seabed. In some cases, this is just changing technology types. In others, it's sharing routing and taking a more holistic approach between multiple generators using the same trenches, the same landing points, and making sure that if we are actually having to damage the natural world, we are doing it in a way where we are getting the most possible benefit from that, and we're not doing it in a piecemeal approach. So yeah, on the map on the right-hand side, that represents £54 billion of investment, which is probably, given current exchange rates, close to about 60 billion US dollars. That facilitates an extra 32 terawatt hours of wind power, which would otherwise be curtailed in the 2030s, and results in a net saving for consumers in Britain of 5.5 billion. So even though we have spent an additional 7.8 billion in capital costs, our consumer savings are over 13 billion pounds, which is absolutely astonishing, really. But again, this does come with a lot of onshore works. We are recommending 94 new onshore recommendations up to 2030. Some of these are completely new circuits, new circuit corridors, while others are actually reconductoring and making sure that we're using the best of the current assets we've got, uprating to higher voltages and making sure, again, that we can get power to where it needs to be at the least cost and enable our green transition. This isn't the end of the picture, though. We are also now considering an additional 18 gigawatts that was leased by Crown Estate Scotland, and also looking ahead to another leasing round that's being conducted between the southwest of England and Wales, looking at 4 gigawatts of floating offshore wind projects in a region we call the Celtic Sea. And as the ESO, we are further transitioning from being a legally separate company within National Grid to what is being described as a future system operator. What that means and what we will be in the future is still being defined. But I think the only direction of travel is to coordinate our approach even more, consider across vectors, additional storage, interconnection to Europe, hydrogen, and anything else you can really imagine. And that seems to be the direction of travel. There's an awful lot we can say, and our website's a great resource for all of our publications. Equally, if you want to get in touch with us, please feel free. And some of our project partners can be found below in the links there. Looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tom. Appreciate that. And Rob, you're going to tell us a bit of what's going on in the US.
Sure, and I can pull up my slides here. If you could confirm, Shawn, can you see those?
Yes, and it moved.
Yeah. Whoops. Yeah, starting there. Okay, well, thanks, everybody. It's great to be here. This is fun. You didn't mention, Shawn, I went to college next door to the Maritime Peninsulas in Maine, and had some nice trips up there, and look forward to a bike trip in Nova Scotia this summer if anybody has recommendations. But I work in the Washington, D.C. area on transmission policy around the country here in the U.S. Done a little bit internationally. Usually our focus is on low-cost decarbonization, and that kind of leads me to transmission. All roads end up leading us back towards transmission infrastructure as the best way to get low-cost and reliable decarbonization. And we've had some successes in the U.S. I want to point to some historical positive experiences to sort of give people hope that there's an approach that works, and then talk about some of the recent policy initiatives going on here. First of all, around 2008, 2009, 10, there was a set of transmission initiatives around the country. And this shows where they are. These are the names of the grid operators: the California ISO, Southwest Power Pool, Mid-Continent ISO, and ERCOT is the Texas one. Each of these, if you look at the colors on this map, you can kind of see they're tapping into remote renewable resource areas. This is the wind map, but the similar goes for solar. Actually, in West Texas, you can get about twice as much output out of the solar plants there compared to East Texas. So, the opportunity has been to, access cheaper land or higher output resources, as well as sort of, as you heard Tom describe, looking at multi-benefits. So it's not just tapping into the clean energy, but there's a reliability and resilience benefit from these lines, as well as savings on generation capacity investment. You can have lower reserve margins, and you can avoid certain lower voltage, smaller capacity transmission lines, which are less efficient, by building large scale transmission. So when you put all those benefits together, most of these have had 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 benefit cost ratios. And to illustrate some of the reliability benefit, actually, a number of these lines that were built, like on the top center there, lines built largely to get high quality wind resources out of North and South Dakota and Iowa and towards Illinois, Chicago, and points east. Well, those were the same lines that kept the lights on during Winter Storm Uri last year, when the power flowed the other direction from the Mid-Atlantic region, where I am here, towards the Midwest, MISO, and then into SPP in the upper Midwest. And that's the way the grid should be expected to operate. We have a Pacific DC intertie out in the west that sends a ton of solar starting right about at this time of day up to the north, and then towards the end of the day, wind and hydro and other resources get shipped down south to Southern California. So we expect not only this sort of unidirectional power flow issue, but power moving back and forth, which I think you would expect in this Atlantic Loop type of scenario connecting provinces and the Northeast U.S., especially as you look at the need for sort of clean, firm resources, the terawatt hours of storage or something that I certainly sort of drool about. We have short duration batteries on the US power system, but we don't really have clean long duration storage. And so the more we can interconnect with Canada, this is true in the Western provinces, Central and Eastern, I think, we can get a really reliable and low carbon portfolio. So let me go to my next slide here, if I can get it to move. Oh, there we go. This is the second and last slide. So in terms of policy initiatives, I think there's broad recognition here in Washington and around the states now that transmission has become extremely important for all the reasons I described, both sort of reliability benefits and clean energy benefits. So policymakers have been busy. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, where I used to work, and is about a block away from where I sit, has a nationwide rule on transmission planning and cost allocation that has this holistic, multi-benefit, scenario-based transmission planning requirement for all regions of the country to undertake 20 years forward, looking at the future resource mix. And so that effort is well under its way. A few regions are not waiting for a final rule or compliance. They're getting busy on that already. The California ISO and MISO in particular are working very hard on plans moving forward now. Congress has been very active as well. There was a bipartisan infrastructure law that strengthened federal backstop permitting authority, provided a new financing tool, transmission facilitation program. And then in the Inflation Reduction Act, which was what people describe internationally as the biggest US climate bill ever, there's a significant amount of funding for transmission loan guarantees. There's funding for offshore and interregional transmission planning, around $100 million for that. And then funding for siting and permitting authorities to study different options to optimize the transmission system. And I see I'm at about time, so I'll turn it back to you, Shawn, and look forward to the conversation.
Great, Rob. Thanks very much. Lots of food for discussion here. Looking forward to getting into it. And Elisa is going to fill us in on what's happening with the offshore power in Eastern Canada. Over to you.
Sure. Yes, thanks very much, Shawn. And I also just want to thank the Ecology Action Centre and the Conservation Council of New Brunswick for having me. And I'm just going to pull up my slides here. All right, I think probably everybody can see that okay. So basically, I mean, today what I wanted to do, I think this is a really interesting discussion, obviously, and also, really important when it comes to how we're going to achieve our net zero ambitions. And as Shawn said, I've been very busy, or we have, over the past few months, because the interest in offshore wind has really ramped up considerably in the past year. And really my aim today is just to offer some thoughts on why and how offshore wind could and should, further drive the discussion around interregional planning, and also why it shouldn't be overlooked. So, in some jurisdictions, as we've already heard, offshore wind has been the impetus for some of the major, electricity planning system initiatives. But before I get into that part, what I want to do is just kind of take a step back and talk about, why are we even looking at marine renewables? Canada and Atlantic Canada is resource rich. We have a lot of other renewable energy options, and some coming at a lower cost. And that's always been kind of the discussion is, offshore wind's at a higher cost at this point, and we have other options that we could be looking at. But these are some of the reasons, and this is just to give some food for thought. But the first is obviously in Atlantic Canada, we have to look at how we're going to phase out coal. We have emission reduction targets that we want to meet. Nova Scotia, for example, has a target of 80% renewables by 2030. And then, of course, we're also looking at net zero. How do we meet net zero by 2050? But combined with that, we're also looking at electrification of all of our different industries, transport, buildings. And there are studies out there, and a lot of you that are on this webinar today are fully aware that we're going to need more electricity or clean electricity to meet those targets. And that looks like 2 to 3 times the amount that we currently have. But then when we take into consideration, this discussion around energy security and resiliency and the drive to also have Canada produce green hydrogen, ammonia to help meet both domestic and export needs and demands, I think that amount's going to increase even more. So we need to get those, the renewable electricity from somewhere. And I'm a firm believer that we really need to look at all of our renewable resources, but also the strengths and the unique opportunities in different regions and how they can serve Canada as a whole. And then the last piece I would just touch on in Atlantic Canada, where we're also unique in this, is that we have a very strong, ocean industry background. We have a workforce and expertise that can also service offshore wind development as we move forward. So just to put it into perspective a bit more, why offshore wind? And first I will also credit these images came from Ager Insights, which is a consultancy in Europe that we've been working with a lot, as well as I think the province of Nova Scotia has as well. But this just gives you some, a better understanding of what the actual offshore wind potential is. And you can see the North Sea has, very good resources, and that's the purple area, and it's squared off. But then you can also see Atlantic Canada, has tremendous potential as well. And so if we want to define that more, if you look at the image on the right, that comes down to about, a little over 900 gigawatts. Obviously, we would not be developing that much, and there's constraints that you have to think about. But even when we think about Nova Scotia recently setting a target of 5 gigawatts of offshore wind, development by 2030, or at least leasing by 2030, I mean, that's very significant. And we can see that that's obviously going to meet more than just Atlantic Canada or Nova Scotia's needs. And there's a potential for it to meet national and also international needs. But it comes down to this discussion around, how do we actually realize that, but also understand the opportunity better. So this is just the last few points I wanted to make. And it is around, what is that market potential for offshore wind? Because I think it's a lot bigger than what we've been thinking about. A lot of times you hear in discussion, well, Atlantic Canada or Nova Scotia isn't going to need, the electricity from those large scale projects, which is a lot of the reason this discussion has really been dominated by the potential for offshore wind to green hydrogen production, and for both domestic but export use. And then we also have the option of using offshore wind for heavy industries. But I think all of those things combined, we still have to think about electricity infrastructure, and really what the long-term and strategic play is here. So the discussion today is mainly focused around electricity to the grid. We know offshore wind can be used for provincial and regional needs. But I think we also need to explore, how can it meet national requirements? What is the potential for export to the US? And that obviously requires very strategic and collaborative and coordinated discussions amongst different provinces, internationally, and so on. And so the last thing I would just, leave everyone with is that when we think of these different markets, we know that offshore wind could be a lowest cost option to help achieve decarbonization goals. But really, it comes down to a number, of policy supports that are going to be required. But ultimately, what needs to come first is also an understanding of what, the long-term electricity system and transmission infrastructure is going to look like. And that will really be critical to that discussion. So I will leave it at that for now. And hopefully that provides some food for thought, and really interested and happy to participate in the discussion going forward.
Thank you, Elisa. So just a word for those who would ask questions. You have two options here. You can post in the Q&A that you'll find at the bottom of your screen, or if you want to do it directly and have your face on the screen, you can raise your hand, and we will call on you when the Q&A session opens up. So feel free to take advantage of either option. I wanted to kick off with a discussion about the barriers to interregional planning, and that is, you know, I did a little commercial here for the Canadian Climate Institute. I did a report for them earlier this year, which you can find on their website, about the Nordic power grid and the cooperation that is and interregional planning that goes into the Nordic grid that allows Norway to provide hydro and when Denmark has strong wind to sell to Norway and back it up. But they have very robust architecture for interregional planning. Elisa, maybe start with you and then Pierre-Olivier for the Canadian context, and then our friends for some of the foreign issues. But where are the hurdles to actually having a more efficient regional approach to energy transmission and trade?
Start with me, Shawn? Sure. Yeah, I would say, I mean, I think one of the challenges is really developing a coordinated approach amongst all of the provinces and breaking down. I know it's, you know, people use the term or the phrase breaking down silos all the time, but really here, if we're serious about how we're going to meet net zero, I think there really needs to be a realistic and practical approach to how we go about doing that, and not on a province by province basis. So, you know, we need the key players at the table. I think the other thing is, you know, I think back to, for example, the Clean Power Roadmap for Atlantic Canada, things like, you know, offshore wind, tidal really don't have much of a mention. And I think, you know, one of the questions that comes to mind for me is what are the assumptions based on? How are the scenarios developed? And really, you know, the need for transparent processes in all of this. And I think part of that is also, you know, hinged on bringing the appropriate stakeholders to the table. I think that is a bit of a barrier, is just ensuring that we have the right people involved in the right organizations and making it broad, but also achieving the balance of efficiency, which obviously is, you know, very difficult when you branch out like that.
Yeah, I think from my side, I think the big obstacle is the absence of a history of collaboration among provinces in electricity. So given like the historical silos in which we've you know we've grew, then it's hard to get out of that. So how to start the conversation, how to start collaboration, it's a challenge. The federal government is trying to push for some conversation through the Atlantic Loop. You know, Elisa was mentioning the need to be transparent. We cannot say the Atlantic Loop discussions are totally transparent. It seems to be a black box, but it seems that there are some discussions. I think governments, provincial governments, also haven't realized what it takes to decarbonize their economy. So given the lack of understanding of what it takes to decarbonize, they don't feel the pressure to actually see what are the options, because they don't really think about what it takes. But if each government had some scenarios, credible scenarios on what it takes to decarbonize, then, and if we were providing, or someone was providing them with options to decarbonize, then they would realize the value of having some joint planning and joint transmission planning. So I think there's a lot of awareness to bring to our own governments in terms of what are your decarbonization plan? Do you know what you talk about? And I think they don't really, or they don't really understand, and they can't see the options. What are the options to achieve these targets? So there are still too few plans showing what are the options and what are the choices. And given the lack of options that they can see, they don't see the need to do the regional planning that we need to do.
Very good. And I would add, I think that the idea that this is a unidirectional flow of trade will create way more barriers in Atlantic Canada than a project that is seen as being export oriented for Atlantic producers as well. And I think that's very important politically as well as it is for economic efficiencies. Rob and then Tom, how are in your various jurisdictions are planners getting over the hurdle of actually having regional approaches?
Yeah, sure. Well, these are certainly familiar issues here in the U.S., even if we take, somewhat smaller areas like different parts of New York State. I mentioned the upstate to downstate, and that requires, cooperation within different, people and communities there, but, across the Northeast or across the country. We need that type of regional cooperation. I think it first of all begins with some level of consensus about the benefits and the need for some, larger macro scale transmission planning, which is why, the work that all of you are doing here, and in fact, this webinar are critical. We've had a lot of minds changed here in the United States just in the last 2 years. It's an impressive amount of change of views of the recognition of the importance, and that's critical, and that's step one. But then, when you get to, actually moving interregional transmission forward, you run into the typical barriers of transmission. I describe them as the 3 Ps: planning, permitting, and paying. Paying meaning cost allocation, who's going to pay for the lines. And that one's usually the hardest, and that's why we haven't yet made a lot of progress on interregional cost allocation here in the U.S. yet. But that needs some work, but that can be solved, like we've solved, like we've built regional transmission here in the U.S. I mean, again, 10, 12 years ago, about 13 Midwestern states got together and they hammered out an agreement on the plan. They figured out what would be the optimal configuration based on benefits and costs, and then they agreed on an allocation of the cost. The permitting was then separate, but when we had that open, independent regional process where utilities were very involved, but they weren't the only ones involved. There was active participation of government officials and various stakeholders in the industry. Then out of that process came a lot more trust in the need for the lines, and that sort of regional acceptance of the need then fed into the permitting process, where here in the U.S., states and sometimes localities have to approve lines. But in that Midwestern case, 16 out of 17 were approved, largely because there was this general recognition that they were needed. Put that in contrast to the recent failures in New England of the lines through Maine and New Hampshire, connecting Quebec and Massachusetts. There was not this kind of recognition, certainly in the state of Maine, about the need for that line. Voters were not exposed to that issue or the benefits. So we need to do a lot more of that, work to articulate and, study the benefits in a process that people trust. So these 3 Ps are kind of circular. They each are sort of rely on each other, but, I do think they can be addressed if we work on each of them.
But Tom, what's the experience in the UK with overcoming some of those challenges?
So I think from my perspective, there are 2 tenets that I'd like to explore. The first is that we have a very strong regulator. They take their direction from central government and effectively hold us all to account. Myself not actually being involved so much in a company anymore that actually owns any assets. We are strongly independent and are an independent voice. The regulator makes that so, and we recognise that it's the correct thing to do. And I think that direction of travel will only help us to improve our transparency of what we do. So I think that is the first major element, that we are able to work across different transmission owners, people with different interests, local distribution companies, and effectively collect their voices and make sure that we are accounting for all of those interests. I think the second is the strong history we've got of scenario planning. I believe we're in our 11th year of publishing the future energy scenarios, which take 4 distinct views of how we can get to 2050. They range in our ambition and technology choices, all the way from what we call leading the way, which sees us achieve net zero in 2047, I believe, to a scenario in which we don't actually get there, which is called falling short. We have 2 other scenarios as well, one that focuses on electrification and also one that focuses on more of a transition towards hydrogen. And this informs all of our planning activities. And by testing what we're doing against robust scenarios that are credible, have got so much stakeholder engagement, so much engagement with academia, and making sure that we can fulfill via regret analysis, to make sure that we are doing the right thing and we can back our recommendations to the hilt, really. That allows our regulator and ultimately our government to have a lot of trust in what we do. Equally, that informs our view on the rest of Europe. Bit of a contentious issue in recent history, which is a shame, because ultimately we do rely on our European partners, and equally they rely on us. And again, those type of exercises allow us to find what the optimal volume of interconnection is to Europe for GB consumers, and equally what that means for our decarbonisation. I think the final aspect is that through thorough scenario planning, we can actually go and test relatively minor changes now. We're currently investigating strategically placed demand and how we can go and stimulate demand throughout the country to effectively reduce cost, and in instances reduce transmission build, because we recognise that we are asking for a lot, but equally there are alternatives, and if that's non-network solutions, long-term storage, electrolysis, we are in the right position to investigate that. And ultimately it is a moral and ethical thing to do, is to make sure that we are on that journey and we make it equitable.
Okay, thanks very much. Let me ask about the situation in the US as a result of the recent Inflation Reduction Act, which has a lot of money and a lot of impetus on, as you mentioned off the top, Rob, interregional planning and clean energy. How can Canadian officials hook into US interregional planning right now to make sure that Canadian producers and Canadian jurisdictions are part of the North American plan? We hear often at the federal level, at the political level, about a North American energy effort, but you know, when you get down to the ground level, there's an awful lot of silos still. So Rob, start with you, and then maybe Elisa and Pierre-Olivier, you could jump in there in terms of how you see it.
Yeah, sure. Well, a bunch of ideas pop into my head about better integration of coordinated planning across the border. And I'm sure there's a lot that I'm not aware of in terms of conversations going on. But you know, one person who jumps to mind is a person who is from Canada and now is our Secretary of Energy, Jennifer Granholm. I would think she would be very interested in this, and she has been, you know, a real leader on transmission, setting up a new grid deployment office at the agency. So that's certainly one place to go to discuss the issues, and you know, how some of the plans and resources that they have can be, you know, used in a coordinated way. You know, for example, studies that the national labs do can look at cross-border opportunities. The NESCO in New England states They're very active in New England regional transmission planning, and I would think and expect there would be dialogue there. In New York, the governor's office or the Public Service Commission would be, and of course the two ISOs, New York ISO and ISO New England, would be good places to connect. So I would encourage all of that in terms of joint planning. Again, the ISOs are about to be told by FERC to do a lot more, coordinated regional planning, and at least work more on. We don't quite know what they're going to be required to do on interregional planning, but I expect that's coming soon.
Very good. Pierre-Olivier.
Yeah, I would add two different things. The first one is that if you look at the decarbonization plans of U.S. states, especially in the Northeast, I've reviewed all of them in New England and New York. They all mention that regional collaboration is needed, and then some of them explicitly mention Quebec and Canada as being, source for balancing wind and solar generation. So within states there is some recognition. So there, in a way, it's already there. Some awareness is there. Now, in addition to what Rob mentioned in terms of where the planning should be done, the NERC, which is the North American Electricity Reliability Council, is a bi-national institution looking at reliability questions, but also looking at future reliability issues. And they should be more proactive in terms of looking at what the network of the future will look like. And they should commission studies to say, well, how will reliability change and evolve over time? And the region I'm looking at, the NPCC, is one of the sub-region of the NERC, and these are already existing organizations involving utilities that have to report annually to these reliability organizations, and they have to declare what are their plans, what are their reserve margins, their anticipated needs, and they should be a little bit more forward looking in terms of what's coming up. And they're sadly lagging behind in terms of decarbonization goals that their own members have. So there should be some push on NERC bodies and NPCC and the other ones across North America to actually look at the reliability challenges that the addition of more renewable will create, and how we can plan for that. And transmission, more interregional transmission, is a solution for many of these reliability issues.
Very good. Elisa, what opportunities for maritime offshore producers in the U.S.? I mean, it seems like a tempting market.
Yeah. You mean just in terms of development or to export electricity to the U.S.?
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's complicated by one thing, which I would say is, the U.S. is very focused on developing their offshore wind supply chain, and so there are the local content rules and things like that in terms of them trying to develop their offshore wind projects there. But at the same time, we know that there are challenges in that. And so I would say, in terms of how we can, move this agenda forward and further collaborate, there's definitely, the potential for export from Canada to the U.S. when it comes to offshore wind. But again, it comes to this transmission infrastructure question. And to advocate for more collaboration, I mean, from an industry perspective, I think, there is an opportunity for industry to come together from both countries and advocate for that as a potential option, that there needs to be more collaboration on interregional transmission. But the other thing that kind of also comes to mind is just all of the recent discussion around Canada and Germany and the Hydrogen Alliance agreement, and how powerful that kind of agreement is in driving change and driving relationships. And it's common for countries to do things like that when there is a very shared need and goal. And so I see something like that also being potential to help drive the transmission and interregional planning discussion as well between Canada and the U.S.
Very good, thank you. I think we'll turn now to the audience, and if there's a lull, I can jump in with more questions. But we were going to invite Ken Summers to ask his question of the panelists. So Ken, do we have you live here?
I think from what I can see, Ken has actually dropped off the meeting, so maybe we can move to the questions that have come in the chat.
Okay, well let's move on to that. I think maybe Pierre-Olivier, you might be able to handle this one. Do you know what is the carbon footprint of the manufacturing and transportation process for wind turbines? They're big construction projects. And how does that differ offshore as opposed to onshore?
Thank you for the question. I cannot fully answer the question. What I can say is that, you know, when we look at life cycle emission studies, wind is always, you know, among the lowest impact generation sources, with solar and hydro. And for hydro, it depends on which type of hydro and with or without reservoir. But wind is always among the lowest carbon emission over the life cycle. So that, of course, life cycle means production of the wind turbines and installing them. There's no big difference between offshore and onshore wind turbines in terms of carbon footprint per kilowatt hour, because, you know, there's a bigger footprint for offshore winds, but they produce more. So in the end, the per kilowatt hour footprint is about the same, and they're, you know, extremely better than all the other options, non-renewable options. So beyond that, you know, we need to go into specific studies, you know, for the exact footprints, and I don't have them in top of my mind.
Okay, so I'm going to read this next question for Tom, and because, to be honest with you, I don't fully understand it, but I'm hoping you do. There's some acronyms in there, among other things. Did the HND in UK consider the merchant connectors like UK, Norway, or UK, Germany, UK, France, and possible ones that might come? And how will the NG ESO treat them?
Yep.
Explain that a little bit as well as answer it, Tom.
Yeah, so this question relates to interconnection between European countries. So we effectively have subsea HVDC links. So Great Britain is currently interlinked to the island of Ireland. So it causes some confusion, but Northern Ireland isn't part of our remit in the ESO, but that's covered separately. We're also interconnected to France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Norway, and also soon to be Denmark and Germany. So effectively, we do have a spider's web of connections under the sea. I guess in some ways this question is quite simple. All of these connections form part of our various backgrounds we assess against. When we're designing the network, we take account of the space that's already been reserved for them. So we're making sure that we're not effectively using space allocated to pre-existing projects. And we also have an economic model of the European markets to effectively say, this is our anticipated behavior, and we also run sensitivities on that behavior as well. So effectively reflecting new European targets on renewable energy, what our price forecasts for those markets are as well, just so we understand what the flow of energy should be across those interconnectors. So as I say, they form an integral part of our background. Looking to the future, we do have a separate work stream on what we call multi-purpose interconnectors. There's sometimes an industry called wind connectors, where effectively you have interconnection between two countries and a wind farm in the middle. This poses a huge amount of questions in terms of who has jurisdiction over it, any subsidy regime that may be applied to it, residual balancing, and a whole host of legal challenges as well. So that is something we're working on, but it's not currently part of our planning. So it'll add an extra layer of complexity, which we're really looking for progress over perfection here. And as I say, we will look to do something with that in the future.
Very good, Tom. Thank you very much. Question from Matthew Garrett. Why is it seemingly easier for Canada to make an alliance with Germany for green hydrogen production than with our next door neighbor for power transmission? It seems like the latter is a more obvious choice. And again, I think, Elisa, this is something you referred to with the local content, but are there structures in place that can help us break that down? Why is it so difficult?
I mean, I'll try to comment on that. I think that it's probably a question that would be well posed to government, but I can offer some opinions and thoughts. I honestly, I think it comes down to priorities, and I think there's been a huge, and not that electricity infrastructure isn't a priority, but we saw how much demand and discussion there was around green hydrogen, particularly around this energy security discussion, and seeing what's happening in Europe, and that was a huge driver for that. When there's a crisis and things that we need to deal with, that's when those kinds of agreements and things come to the forefront, just from what I've seen. But at the same time, I do think that we've put a lot of weight on building new clean electricity, building new renewable electricity, and producing it, but not as much on this this transmission and infrastructure piece that really needs to happen before. And I think that discussion, especially with webinars like this and just some of the work that's being done across Canada, will rise to the top in terms of importance. And I think that's when we'll see that there is more of an impetus and need from government to really step in and have these discussions from government to government. And I would say it's on a lot of us to really force that issue and make sure that it's understood as being a top priority.
Good. Rob or Pierre-Olivier, would you like to comment on that?
Well, not really, other than just cooperation's hard with anybody, even within states here in the U.S. I'm sure sometimes within provinces and then across border. I mean, one issue that it's worth pointing out is there's often unfortunate protectionism that happens within the electric industry, and it's not the sort of type that you see in international trade always, but it's just people own generation in one area, and if transmission brings competing generation from another area, then there are powerful entities that try to block transmission. So it's not even necessarily an international issue. We see it within parts of states and across states within the US, and it's just a feature of an unfortunate feature of the kind of the electric industry politics that prevents good cooperation. But again, as with any of these challenges, that too can be overcome.
Pierre-Olivier?
No, nothing really to add, except that just maybe for the question, I think the alliance with Germany on hydrogen is really more an official statement than a real concrete alliance for real specific projects. So it's easy to make a media declaration and then nothing will happen for years.
Right. And Elisa did mention the local content rules, and I think that when governments are involved in driving economic opportunity and economic development, local content rules are part of the political package that allows them to sell it to the local population and justify it. So we see it across the board, not just in electricity, but it's always a challenge for the exporters to meet U.S. local content rules are a big issue for Canada, aiming at the U.S. market and not just in power. So maybe a question again for Pio and for Rob. Can you comment on how states deal with regional transmission organizations and FERC exercising their sovereignty? Canada's constitution gives management and electricity to provinces. How can we overcome some of the barriers to interregional planning?
It's a difficult question. Oh, sorry, Rob.
No, go ahead.
Okay, well, again, Shawn mentioned the Nordic example. Nordic countries are different countries. They have no obligation to collaborate. They just realized that through collaboration and through regional planning, they would actually lower their network cost. So it was in their own self-interest to collaborate. And I believe, and as I mentioned in my presentation, it is, trade is in the interest of everyone. If you trade more, then you will benefit from some gains. So it is in the self-interest of every province and state to collaborate and plan and trade when it makes sense, and not trade when it doesn't make sense, but usually it makes a lot of sense. So it is some barriers are just psychological, some protectionism that Rob mentioned, but it is in the self-interest of all provinces and all states to collaborate to decarbonize. Otherwise, their own cost would increase or they wouldn't benefit as much. Quebec has already a decarbonized grid, but so in a way, Quebec doesn't have to collaborate with its neighbors. Strangely, it's more Quebec that wants to collaborate and then build transmission lines with US states when Quebec is already decarbonized. So sometimes, it's the interest seems to be ill-placed and we don't really understand, but as already mentioned, we need to take all the occasions to mention all the benefits that decarbonization brings. And if we do it regionally and collaboratively, it will be even more benefits and costs will be lower. So we need to document that. And then and as Rob mentioned, be careful on how we split the cost and who pays for what. But in the end, as there's a collective benefit, then it shouldn't be impossible to find a way to, share the burden.
Yeah, and I'll just agree with Pierre-Olivier. The successful examples in the U.S. that covered multiple states really did have regional agreements between states and across the region. They weren't really forced by FERC. I think it would be easier if Canada had a FERC, but FERC isn't really forcing these things here in the U.S. It's really essential to have the agreements between the states, and I would imagine for the provinces as well. And if you have no FERC and all you have are provincial governments, that's just the reality you have to work within.
So I want to make sure I understand this. Do we have a question? Oh, there we have a question from Kelsey Lane. If the panelists can make a recommendation to the federal government, Canadian federal government, to entice cooperation, what would those be? How do you get the federal government to? How can the federal government, in fact, entice cooperation? So it's two-step, I guess. One is getting the federal government on board, and then the federal government getting the provinces on board.
So I can quickly start. The federal government has already gave some loan guarantees to some transmission lines between in the Atlantic provinces. So the federal government is already in the business of providing loan guarantees and financing some transmission interconnections. So the federal government could basically tell provinces, we are ready to pay for some parts of these transmission lines, given that you show us the studies. And the federal government has already done some studies on the nice interties. So the federal government requirements should be to, ask higher requirements in terms of studies. What are your decarbonization plans? How do you plan to actually, produce the power that is needed? And show us some scenarios where you do it alone, only in your province, and when you do it collaboratively with other states and provinces. And we will fund some of these interconnections that are needed, that are proven to be cost effective to reduce the cost of decarbonization. So this would be really straightforward and directly aligned with what NRCan is already doing, but it should be promoted more aggressively. Okay,
Elisa?
Yeah, I'd say, I like this question, but I actually find it tricky to answer because I think Rob did say, I think it was Rob, that cooperation is really hard to do, and it is. And I think the key thing here, and I said it in my opening remarks, is both governments would really need to take a look realistically and practically at what they can achieve with what they're currently doing. I believe Canada is doing a lot, to try to address this issue, but we know that we're still at risk at not achieving our targets and goals for net zero. And I think an easy thing, maybe not easy, but a first step would be an agreement around, or a recommendation for an agreement around, an intergovernmental working group or committee or something between Canada and the United States. That may already exist, and I just may not be knowledgeable about it, but something like that to really understand where gaps are and what the path moving forward or the scenarios could be would be helpful.
Very good. And I guess the last question, I'll just throw it open. We talked about the cost benefits of interregional cooperation. We've talked about the environmental benefits in terms of in terms of decarbonization. Are there other socio-economic benefits that come from this that can be sold to local populations and through them to local governments? Rob, I see you nodding, so and then Tom, and then maybe we'll sign off.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Just to emphasize the reliability and resilience as we get to high penetration renewable grid. It's not, system planning is no longer really just about the hot summer afternoon, or the winter peak. It's multiple times and scenarios around the year when you can find yourself in a time of scarcity. And we're seeing that all across the US. I expect other countries are seeing the same thing. And what often saves the day is when you can have power sharing from one region that might have a surplus at that particular moment because of the supply that's available and the weather pattern that might be present in one region, able to share with the region that's in need. And we see that time and time again. And it's that bidirectional or multi-directional flow of power that provides reliability and resilience for everybody.
Okay. Tom?
Yeah, I would also echo that. The situation in Europe this winter will be particularly difficult given the situation in Ukraine, potential for gas supplies being very limited, being able to utilize our renewable resources and equally making sure that there is plentiful power to circulate Europe. It is of massive importance to us. And there are myriad benefits in terms of air quality, actually reducing the cost of electricity for consumers in terms of not having a marginal plant that's based on a fuel cost in the future. But the cost of mitigating climate change as well is just astronomical. There is no way in which this doesn't make financial sense and is not also good for people's health. It promotes high-skilled jobs. It develops new manufacturing bases. Honestly, I can't see the downside of this, which is quite a nice position to be in.
I think we have one last question from Kelsey. Is that right or no?
I think we caught Kelsey's question.
Okay, we're good then. Well,
yeah,
right on time, and it's been a great discussion with you all. I think I know this is being recorded, so I hope it will be made available. And I think there's a lot of information here for people to take back and to ponder and to take forward to their various stakeholders and politicians and regulators. So thank you very much to the panelists for your time. Thank you for the organizers for pulling all this together, and thank you for the audience for being here.
Yeah,
thank you
very much again to everyone. And yeah, thanks to Rob, Pierre-Olivier, Tom, Elisa, and Shawn. It was really great to have you and hear this conversation. As we mentioned, I think there was a question on this that came in the Q&A, so I'll ask panelists if they are comfortable with sharing their slides. And we'll get back to you guys on that later. And we will have a bit of a reaction. We're hoping to be able to post to the webinar on the Ecology Action Centre website. So we'll be seeing that in the future. And just looking forward to continuing this conversation with everyone. So really thanks to everyone who attended, and thanks again for everyone who came together to deliver this webinar.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.